I now look to Leilani Schweitzer to address the patient perspective toward CRPs. Leilani, from a patient perspective, how might CRP enhance the trust between patient and providers and their organizations?
Thank you, Elaine. So I think it's important for people who are thinking about CRPs to remember that patients are completely unfamiliar with this. They don't even know what this means until something very challenging and difficult has happened to them. No one goes into a hospital expecting the unexpected to happen to them. So if that does happen, their trust in the institution, the hospital, maybe their physician, that trust is damaged if it's not destroyed entirely. I feel like can be great benefit from acknowledging to patients that their lives have been impacted completely, or maybe just a little bit, but nonetheless, they have felt the impact of a medical event. When my son died, his death was complex, and the aftermath of it impacted many, many lives. One of his nurses who took care of him, she's no longer working as a nurse. One of his neurosurgeons, he quit practicing medicine as well. So the impact of these events go far and wide. I think there's a lot of value in being transparent with patients about their experiences. And what that really does is it tells the patients that their experiences matter and are valued. And that can be the beginning of a way to start to rebuild that trust that's been destroyed. And I say beginning because I think it's helpful to think of CRPs, the communication and resolution component of it, as it's a conversation. It's the development of a relationship. It's not typically a single conversation. And most patients, they won't be familiar with the process of reviewing medical care. They'll be surprised at how complex it is, probably surprised at how much time it takes. So for a risk manager who maybe has a demanding caseload, which is probably frequently what happens, for them, weeks or maybe months is a drop in the bucket. But if you're a patient who has experienced something in their healthcare, that can be a very long time to spend wondering what's going on. So that's why that communication is really, really important, to not leave patients wondering about what's going on. I also believe it's very important to help set expectations for patients. That's more conversations, that's more discussions. And again, those conversations are moving towards rebuilding trust. Also, patients, they don't experience a poor medical outcome in a context of maybe what we'll discuss today, of tort reforms or government regulations or legal precedents. For patients, it's a singular experience. It's very personal. It's a very intimate event. And for most patients, after an unexpected outcome, they want three things. They want an apology. They want the dignity of an explanation of what happened to them. And I hear this again and again when I talk to patients. They want to see improvements to ensure that what has happened to them never happens to anyone else. Being transparent and setting expectations, I know that this is challenging for institutions. I recognize that there's many concerns, and often I think someone wants certainty, so maybe the institution, they want to know everything before they start that conversation with a patient. And I think also, unfortunately, there can be maybe a thought that if we start talking to patients, that means we're admitting liability and we're writing a big check. That's a 1, 2, 3 proposition, and that's a dangerous assumption. Communicating with patients is not admitting guilt. It's a dangerous thing to think that way, because doing nothing, not communicating with patients, not talking to them, is really doing a lot. Saying nothing is leaving patients to answer their own questions, to find their own answers, to seek out information that maybe is not accurate. It's putting a lot of obligation on patients when they're in a very vulnerable state. And patients, they really come into these programs at a baseline of distrust and uncertainty. So that's where they're starting down here. And not communicating early and often, it's missing an opportunity and what I feel is an obligation to build trust with those patients. Here at Stanford, in our Pearl, we call our CRP program Pearl. And the great majority of the care that we look at through our Pearl program, we determine that the standard of care was not breached, fortunately. The care could not have been improved, and what happened was not preventable. And I really believe in those cases, having trust with those patients is even more important because we're asking them to believe that we did a fair review, that we did the best we can. So if there isn't a background and a relationship of trust there, that can be a really difficult thing for patients and their families to understand and to accept.
Leilani, you make several good points, and I just want to address the panel on these 2 points. Number one, you mentioned that sometimes just having information is resolution, answers to questions or uncertainties. Michelle, I'm wondering if you could address that. CRPs are not solely addressing compensation and reimbursement, that sometimes resolution takes a different turn.
Yeah, and that's a really crucial point, and it's something we found over and over again when we've looked at different institutions that have tried this approach. Empirically, we find that between 2/3 and 3/4 of the events that are processed by these programs are events where there was not a standard of care violation. But those events are the most likely to be overlooked by institutions in terms of their communications with patients. They feel satisfied that they did their best, and for many institutions, that's the end of the story. But of course, as Leilani points out, many of these patients go home hurt and confused and quickly angry and seeking answers from outside parties that can lead to litigation. So addressing those events outside the event in which you have a patient or family who's angry in the hospital can be just as important in preventing the needless expenditure of funds and defense costs as quickly settling cases that do involve a standard of care deviation.
And Tom, from the physician perspective, is there a reluctance to have those types of discussions or openness with patients at the fear that that will then trigger compensation?
Well, it's one concern, but I think for physicians, the much more important barrier is that, when care doesn't go as expected, it's really profoundly embarrassing for physicians. It's uncomfortable. We really strive to deliver the best possible care all the time, and it's really overcoming that sort of fear of having an awkward, disappointing conversation that I think stops more physicians than the fear of compensation.
Thank you. And Leilani, just on a crucial element, the trust. How does a patient or family recognize or develop the trust that eliminates the fear they've been taken advantage of or are in an uneven bargaining position?
It's difficult, right? For everyone who's involved, there's somewhat of a leap of faith that we need to trust each other. And for patients, they're really between a rock and a hard place. Yeah. It's not like there's an easy option for them. A legal option, that's always there, but that can be time-consuming and expensive and very emotional. Or there's the need to trust in CRPs, or hopefully that they even have the opportunity for that program to exist. But the baseline, again, for patients, it's a tough spot for them. So it's not like hiring their lawyer and going that road is something that anyone particularly wants to do either.
I was just going to say there may be roles for lawyers outside of bringing litigation, and it may not be reasonable, particularly in a case of serious harm, to expect a patient just to place their trust in the institution and to trust that the offer is fair. I think many institutions who have operated these programs successfully have developed rosters of attorneys that they believe are highly qualified and who will give patients a fair assessment assessment of the offer that's on the table and perhaps help them negotiate the offer a little bit without, in many cases, expecting to take home a third of an award that's already on the table when they come to the case. A group that I'm working with in Massachusetts, for example, has worked with the local bar association to identify attorneys that are interested in interfacing with hospitals and patients around this process. And that can also be helpful in bringing an independent evaluation to bolster a sense of trust and fairness.
Tom, comment?
It's really the transparency that's foundational to developing that trust. And I think organizations don't realize how easy it is to lose that trust and the implications of that. When patients and families think that there's a cover-up, it's almost impossible to rebuild that trust. We've had situations where organizations at that point have given the patient and family the entire medical record, and the question is, well, what pages did you take out? And so without that transparency, you really can't develop that trust.